Actually, it says doctor in the programme. In fact, the doctor refers to a very old PhD in the nature of boredom. I'm an expert in boredom, so you have been warned. But when I'm speaking here today, I suppose I'm speaking with a number of hats on. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but I kind of went a bit off the tracks and became a director in a mental health service. But most of my career, my 30-year career in mental health services, I have spent trying to set up programs to help people with mental health conditions to get jobs. As a result of one of those that I'm going to talk about today, I've actually employed an awful lot of people with mental health conditions. I retired from the British NHS in August this year, and I was in the extraordinary position of my manager had mental health problems and had been in a mental health hospital, and everybody I managed had been in a mental health hospital. I guess my third bit of thing is that I have actually been working for many years with a mental health condition. So I suppose you could call me the modern day equivalent of the lunatic running the asylum. Don't worry, I've retired now, so I'm not doing it anymore. And the service in which I worked for 23 years was in the southwest part of London. It's a big NHS mental health service, employs about 2,600 staff. Every day it sees about 15,000 people with mental health conditions, provides a full range of services for children, adults, older people. And this is the service in which I'm going to talk about, and in which we actually started employing people with mental health conditions. Now, why on earth would we want to do that? Well, I suppose we've known for an awful long time that employment is rather good for you. The Greek philosopher Galen described it as nature's best physician and essential for human happiness. But we do know that being unemployed leads to mental health problems, and if you already have mental health problems, having a job can protect against relapse, makes your symptoms less bad. But quite apart from that, it actually gives you a reason to get up in the morning. It allows you to answer that question that everybody asks. You know, when you meet someone new, it's what's your name, what do you do? And doing bipolar disorder is a serious conversation stopper. I guess the second reason is that mental health services are actually enormous employers. The British NHS is the largest employer in Europe since they disbanded the Red Army. 1 in 20 of the British population work for the National Health Service. We have ourselves an awful lot of jobs. It's not just employers out there, it's us in here. But I think also, if I'm going to go and ask other employers to take on people with a mental health condition, I have to put my own house in order first. And I think we have to be very clear at this conference that prejudice and discrimination don't just exist in the world out there. They exist within mental health services. And I think things are improving, but I know that it's still the case that people who work with a mental health condition in mental health services experience discrimination. I guess, though, actually by employing people with mental health problems in a mental health service, we actually make our services better. First of all, we actually know, any of you here who have mental health problems know that you have gained at least as much from other people who've had similar difficulties, other people who faced similar challenges, as you have of all of the experts. Actually, lived experience is really important in helping you to see that life doesn't, mental health problems are not a death sentence. You can rebuild your life. It is possible to live a decent life with mental health problems. And actually having people with mental health problems working in mental health services shows you that. But it also shows all the other staff that. Because one of the problems that arises is that most mental health professionals only see people when they're in a really bad way. In Graham's trust, the ward that I get admitted to, they don't see me when I'm like this. They see me when I'm in a terrible state. They don't actually know what I do in between times. And I think we've got to show those images of possibility to the staff. But I think, finally, it also serves to break down those kind of them and us barriers, doesn't it? You know, who is them and who is us if the lunatics are running the asylum? So what I'm going to do is try and tell you a little story about a program that I set up starting in 1994, actually. And that was a program to help people with mental health problems to get jobs in the organization that I worked for on the same terms and conditions, ordinary jobs, the same terms, the same pay, the same pensions as any other staff. And it's a journey that started, as I say, in 1994 and is continuing today. We started off, actually, as I say, very small. This program that I'm describing is all actually the fault of Winston Churchill. You see, in 1993, I got what was called a Churchill Travelling Fellowship. They gave me money to trot around North America for a while. And in those journeys, I met people like Judy Chamberlain, people like Paul Carling, people like Sally Zinman. And I met an awful lot of people with mental health conditions running mental health services. So I went back to England and said, we can do that. Why on earth don't we employ people here? Now, this wasn't a good time in England to be saying that. We didn't have any anti-discrimination laws at that point. There was no Disability Discrimination Act. There was also a nasty little government report that said, if you have mental health problems, you can't work in the NHS until you've been out of treatment for at least 2 years. That meant that actually at the time I could have been sacked simply for being diagnosed with mental health problems. But I was lucky. I had a really forward-thinking chief executive who said, are you sure, Rachel? I said, yep, we can do it. He said, all right, go on. And what we did was we set up what we called our supported employment project. I employed one person who themselves had lived experience of going back to work with a mental health condition, and they supported people to get jobs in our organisation. Support at all stages, support to get the jobs, support. We found actually there was a really dodgy time. It was between if you got offered a job and when you actually start. People were terribly excited when they actually got offered a job and then thought, oh no, I can't do it. Oh no, it's going to be too much for me. Actually, that bit between actually getting offered a job and starting a job was a really dodgy time. But let's remember, for many of us, mental health conditions don't just go away. They keep rearing their ugly heads and coming back again from time to time. And I think if we're talking about a long-term fluctuating condition like the one I've got, what we're talking about is needing support on an ongoing basis. It's not just getting someone into work and saying bye-bye. It's actually providing that support, being there when you're needed. Yep, well, since 1995, when we actually first started employing people, we've employed people in 257 jobs in our organisation. I'm not going to go through all this. 44% of those people had a psychosis, a diagnosis of some form of psychosis. Most of them had been admitted to hospital, had all been unemployed. We actually also looked at what happened to those people. 84% of those people are still working. No, I'm lying, actually, one's retired. Now, we've been going a little while. But that's all the sort of dry figures. I wanted just to tell you a little story about someone I know called Emma. Emma developed schizophrenia while she was at university. She took a couple of years out because she was in a pretty bad way for a while. She did go back, though, and she finished her degree, and then she started applying for jobs. She'd applied for 100 jobs, never got an interview, until she applied for a job with me, and we gave her a job as a rehabilitation support worker. She thought that was absolutely brilliant. This is what she said at the time when we did some research on the programme. It made me realise that I can go into mental health as a form of work. I'd thought the doors were barred shut to me. Now I've studied psychology, I've been psychotic, and I work with psychiatric patients, so I'm able to see things from virtually all angles. But that story didn't finish there, actually, because after 3 years, she got promoted. And in fact, then she became an employment support worker, helping other people to get jobs. She then became the manager of our employment support workers. And she went back and did some more studying. Now, whilst she'd been at university, she'd been told by mental health professionals, by a clinical psychologist actually, that she couldn't be a clinical psychologist because people with schizophrenia couldn't be clinical psychologists. She started saying to me, Rachel, is that true? I thought, oh, I don't reckon so. She applied to do clinical psychology training. 2 years ago, she got her doctorate in clinical psychology, and she is now working as a clinical psychologist. That is not a story that's just one story. That's a story that we've seen repeated in many times. These are just some other quotes from people. Another guy said, I will always have severe and enduring mental health problems, but this is no longer my life. I'm a mental health professional. The passion I have for my career is immense. That's what I am. This is what I do. I'm no longer a mental health condition. And what is more, those people can actually inspire hope in other people who are following them, other people who are using our service. Again, another quote from someone that we've employed. When I was in hospital, I thought my life was over until I met a member of staff who had mental health problems and told me about the user employment program. Without their support and encouragement, I wouldn't be here. I'm a happy person doing a job I'm enjoying. However, today I can show them that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I guess, though, we had a problem. We'd done that. This was all working very nicely. But what we had done was persuaded our organisation that you could work with mental health problems, but only if you got special support. You had to have special support. The reality was that an awful lot of people get support from their nearest and dearest, from their own mental health services. They don't need anything from their employer other than for their application not to be thrown in the dustbin when it arrives. So we moved on a bit. We set up our Charter for the Employment of People with Mental Health Problems. This was actually passed by our trust board in 1997. And what we actually said was that first of all, we wanted to welcome applications from people with mental health problems, not just tolerate them, but actually actively to recruit people with mental health problems. So in our advertisements, we say, in this organisation, we welcome applications from people who have experienced mental health problems. We also, on the specifications for the qualifications for jobs, all jobs, from chief executive to cleaner, say personal experience of mental health problems is a desirable qualification. And in the British NHS, if you don't count something, you don't do it. So we also counted how many people with mental health conditions we employed. Can I just say a little health warning here? Don't just go around doing charters. Several organisations in the UK said, oh yes, that's a good idea, Rachel, we'll have a charter. Trouble was, without doing the background work behind it, actually it was worth no more than the paper it was written on. So now, if you come to work in South West London, I have to issue you with a health warning. You don't know whether your colleagues or your boss is one of them or one of us. You see, 10 years after that charter was passed, almost a quarter of our recruits every year have mental health problems, and it gets worse because the higher up you go in the organisation, the more of them you find. So in the lower ranks, it's only 21%. We have these bands in the NHS, don't worry about it. 8 and 9 is the highest you can get, 1 to 4 is the bottom. Almost a third of the bosses have mental health problems. And that includes the chief executive, the director of nursing, and I felt really pleased when we recruited a consultant psychiatrist who had himself been compulsorily detained in our hospital some 10 years previously. We have those people throughout the organisation now, so you don't know. But there are another group of people who had never worked, people who had developed their problems, like Emma, in her teens, people who hadn't been to the university, people who didn't know whether they could work, people who couldn't get a reference of anyone. So we thought, what are we going to do for those people? So first of all, I did something that was a failure. I set up a volunteering scheme. So we allowed people to volunteer in our organisation to get experience and references. A warning, very, very few people switched from being volunteers to being employees. They just kept being volunteers and working for nothing for years and years. We changed it then. We decided to make this into a no. It's not forever. It's a 10-week work experience programme. And not only do you get work experience in the organisation, but you also get help to fill in your application form, help to do your CV, help to look for jobs. This is where we started actually getting something that was more useful. Over the years, the 8 years that we ran that, 142 people started it and 115 finished it. As you can see, those people, in comparison with our supported employees, tended to be more likely to be male, more likely to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, more likely to have been out of work for longer. But if we look at it, 49% of those people went on to work. Some of them in our organisation, others took one look at the mental health service and said, nah, I don't want to work there, I'm going to work somewhere else. But 49% of those people actually got jobs. However, other organisations in the UK said, oh, good idea, Rachel, we'll set up a work experience programme. It doesn't work like that. Actually, you've got to bite the bullet and employ people properly. Then you've got jobs for people to come into. Those organisations who just set up work experience, very few actually went on to working in the organisation. The other thing we've got to remember is that actually some people don't need it. In fact, most people don't need it. And if you make everybody do work experience, work for nothing first, then you actually lose an awful lot of people. Okay, so that's it. A quarter of our staff in southwest London have mental health problems. It's not always been easy. And I suppose there's a kind of hierarchy of hurdles that we had to get over. The first one was those people who said people with mental health conditions shouldn't be anywhere near working in mental health services. It's just not the right place for them. Poor dears can't stand stress, need to be working somewhere else. The next group of people sort of said, well, okay, if someone develops mental health problems, we'll try and keep them, but we won't actively go and recruit them. The next group of people said, yes, that's fine. They can work in the gardens, they can work as secretaries, but not in clinical jobs with the patients. There were then another lot who said, oh, well, yes, all right, but they can work in assistant jobs, unqualified jobs, make sure they've got good supervision all the time. Then, of course, there was someone who said, okay, yes, we can have them, but we're not actively going to train them. And I suppose all of those barriers we encountered, so simply saying, do you mind if people work in the NHS with mental health problems wasn't enough. Actually, we needed to be clear that if you're valuing lived experience, we've got to actively recruit it and actively train people with it. But we've also learned a load of lessons along the line. First of all, you've got to have very strong leadership from the top. When I started this, a number of my senior colleagues would go and knock on the door of the chief executive and say, we don't really have to do this, do we? And it really mattered that the chief executive said, well, actually, yes, you do. I think the second thing we learned was that nobody believes it until they can see it with their own eyes. It really didn't matter how many times I talked about America or how many times I talked about other parts of the world. Nobody believed that it could happen in southwest London until they saw people actually in jobs, working, contributing to the organisation. I think the next thing we did learn, we thought we had to do a lot of work helping people with mental health problems to make the shift from being a patient to being a provider of services. We'd missed out, though, the help we had to give mental health workers in shifting from a relationship of professional and patient to colleague. They actually found that transition incredibly hard, to see people with mental health conditions not as patients but as colleagues. I guess the fourth thing we learned was that we can't expect managers to provide support. Do you really go to your manager and talk about all the difficulties you're having? Like heck you do. If you're ambitious like me, you go and tell them about what you can do. Actually, we need to be providing that support outside of that direct management relationship. That really didn't work. And I guess the final thing is that we did need to provide ongoing support. People don't need support from our programme every minute of every day, but they need to be able to come back. One of my senior colleagues phoned me up the other day and said, I've had to go back to the user employment, Rachel, I'm having a really bad time. And I think we've got to be clear that you need that support available when you need it. We also learned that this was really important. We now had a lot of people with mental health conditions working in our trust. But we also learned that we needed to go another step further. You see, when you employ a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a nurse with mental health problems, they are still employed as a nurse or a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I have worked for 25 years with a mental health condition, but I have worked as a clinical psychologist and a director. What we needed to do was say, actually, there's another sort of relationship that people find helpful. And that's a relationship of equality with their peers, people who are actually walking a similar path to them. Not a one where someone's got special expertise and the other one doesn't have. We know there's an awful lot of evidence now of people talking about how that fosters hope, helps them to feel less alone, helps them to share experiences with someone who understands. But from the person who's on the giving end of that help as well, actually it helps you to make sense of your own experience, to use your experience to be of assistance to someone else. And what I'm talking about here is very much peer support. And it's not just another set of experts. It's actually about, and any of you have been to Recovery Innovations, Mettre in Arizona, they have a lovely definition of peer support. And peer support is about being an expert in not being an expert, and that takes a lot of expertise. It is very easy to give advice, to help someone to find their own solutions, to travel with them, is a very different kind of a relationship. Obviously, peer support has existed since time immemorial. In the old asylums, peer support happened. In England, it used to happen in the smoking rooms of hospitals, where staff kept out. There's also, of course, people have read each other's stories, gleaned the information, read about Stephen Fry. There's ways of getting peer support. E-groups are now incredibly popular. You can have international peer support now. I'm sorry, I'm not quite into Facebook yet, but I'm sure it's a good thing. And doubtless we can have Twittering. I'm sorry, I'm too old. But I guess one of the things that's very much coming to the fore is the whole idea of intentional peer support, actually creating a different kind of post within our services, that of peer support worker. Not another set of professionals, but people whose job it is to actually use their own personal experience to travel alongside people. If any of you go and visit Mettre in Arizona, you will find that 55% of the workforce are peer support workers. They have mental health professionals, but not as many as we're used to. Or, if you want to have psychological therapy, you need someone who's trained as a psychologist. But an awful lot of recovery from mental health problems is not about specialist treatment. It's actually about finding the solutions to your own life. And in that context, peer support does look as if it's really important. I'm not going to go through all of this. Loads of emerging evidence internationally that actually we have to do this in England because everyone wants to save money at the moment. You can reduce use of inpatient beds with peer support. So sack a few of us clinical psychologists and employ a few peer support workers and you can save money on beds. That's not really the point, though. Actually, what you're talking about is helping people to actually live their lives, manage their problems, make the most of their lives with mental health problems, and it does look as if that's possible. So actually now, in England, the Centre for Mental Health are now actually making a formal recommendation that we do that. In 2010, in their publication, they said, as services become more truly focused on service users' needs and accept the value of lived experience, so there are obvious implications for the composition of the workforce. We recommend that organisations should consider a radical transformation of the workforce, aiming at perhaps 50% of care delivery by appropriately trained peer professionals. And I'm afraid one of the things that I do is upset my own profession by saying, and just exactly how many mental health professionals do you need to run a mental health service? Enough of that sacrilege. I guess one of the things we did do a couple of years ago, actually, was stick our toe in the water. I came back and sort of talked about peer support, said, oh, God, not another idea, Rachel. Couldn't you stop having ideas? We tried it. We had a very limited pilot where we employed two people, and we asked another organisation to employ 2 people, just 2 days a week, to come into one of our acute inpatient wards. And it was my job to evaluate it. I was absolutely astounded that such a little thing could make such a big difference. There were hugely significant differences in those people who had spent time with a peer support worker and those who hadn't, in terms of whether people felt anyone had listened to them, really listened to their experiences, whether they felt hopeful about their future, whether they thought they could do the things they wanted to do in life. And if you look at some of the quotes that we've got, she listened and was sympathetic because she'd been through things herself, that kind of mutuality. Or it helped me to feel more hopeful and believe I could still do things because I could see they had. And I guess we've now moved on. This is why this is a continuing journey. We then had to do a big strategy for our organisation. And in 2009, that strategy said we are working towards, over 5 years, 50% of our staff being peer support workers. It's having a little bit of a challenge for our mental health professionals at the moment, this. We'll get there. And we started that journey. We have employed the first 20 of those. Other organisations in England are doing similar. It's not just South West London. And we are seeing a very changed climate now. We've got a Disability Discrimination Act, which says that we're not allowed to discriminate against people on the basis of their mental health condition. And what's more, we've got to make adjustments so that they can actually be employed. We've also got real concern about the rising unemployment rates amongst people with mental health problems. I know we've got a bit of a change in attitudes. It's not manifest yet in any kind of change in employment. Actually, unemployment rates amongst people with mental health conditions have continued to rise over the last decade quite steadily. And so the government's saying, right, the health service has got to take a lead. You've got to start employing them. So anyway, that's a slightly changed environment we've got. We've also got a big campaign by the NHS employers, the organisation that organises employment within the NHS. And it's called the Open Your Mind campaign. And it's supposed to be improving the mental health of the NHS workforce and getting them to employ more people with mental health conditions. These are its aims. I'm not going to bore you by going through those. Basically, it's saying that we don't treat mental health professionals particularly well in England. We cause mental health problems working in the NHS. We've got to do better on that. But also, we have got to actually lead by example and start employing people with mental health conditions. So this is now a national campaign. But I'm going to finish now by just reminding us, actually, that all we have done is reinvented a very old wheel. This is nothing new. In the late 1700s at Bicêtre Hospital in France, the superintendent, Jean-Baptiste Poussin, had a policy of only employing staff from amongst recovered and convalescing patients because, as the great reformer Pinel said, they were the people who were really in the best position to understand and respond sensitively to people's problems, and were the only people who would never, under any circumstances, resort to any form of inhumane treatment. So I'm not suggesting anything radical. I'm just suggesting we learn something that we knew a long time ago. I'll shut up there.